everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, where every show I talk to writers from across the literary spectrum about their work and how they do what they do. From some very huge New York Times bestsellers to folks just getting their work out there for the first time, the Open Mic is about and for writers, aspiring writers, and anyone interested in the experience of writing and publishing here in the modern age. For those who don't know, this show is available by the same name on both YouTube and via all of the major podcast platforms. And you can subscribe to either or both so you never miss a thing. Whether you are a subscriber or this is your first visit here, I would greatly appreciate it if you'd leave me a nice review on either YouTube or whatever podcast app you use. Word of mouth is the absolute best way to help people become aware of artistic endeavors like this one. So even telling one person about it is a really big help. Leaving a review is an even bigger help. So if you do either of those things, I greatly appreciate it. Today's guest, Tom Mead, has made quite a name for himself in recent years as a short story writer in the crime fiction genre, which is, of course, my favorite genre. Many of his stories have appeared in some truly A-list mystery magazines like Ellery Queen and Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. And one of his recent stories, Heatwave, was included in the 2021 edition of Best Mystery Stories from New York City's legendary Mysterious Bookshop that was edited by Lee Child and had a lot of really top name authors in there as well. And now, of course, his debut novel, Death and the Conjuror, is set for release next week. We're recording this on July 5th, so it'll record a week from today on July 12th. It is a classic locked room mystery filled with suspense and some creepy characters and twists and turns of all kinds along the way. The advanced reviews have been great. Comparisons to legends like Agatha Christie and John Dickson Carr. I'm reading and I'm about 2/3 of the way through. I can tell you it's fabulous. So you can bet that I'm really excited today to have him here on the show. Honored to have him here on the show as well. Joining us all the way from his home in the UK. Tom Mead, welcome to the Open Mic. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. I'm very well, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with the novel. We're going to talk about short stories, etc., but I really do want to talk about the novel. I noted that Death and the Conjurer is a classic locked room mystery. Tell us, that's only a bit. So tell us a little bit more about the book.
Yeah, with pleasure. Locked room mystery is obviously the term that I latch onto because it's my favorite subgenre of murder mystery. But really, it's a kind of golden age style murder mystery, written in the vein of the authors that you mentioned, written as a kind of a tribute to the greats of the first half of the 20th century. So the writers I love would be obviously Agatha Christie that you mentioned. John Dickson Carr is a personal favorite of mine because he really mastered the locked room mystery. And also authors like Ellery Queen, Helen McCloy is another one. These are the kind of authors that I like to read. I like the way that they construct the puzzles and the way that but of course, it's not just about the puzzles. It's also about the pace of the plot. It's about the crisp, neat characterization. So when I set out to write Death and the Conjurer, it was about paying tribute to the writers that I admire. So it's set in 1930s London. It deals with two seemingly impossible murders and the apparently impossible theft of a priceless painting, and it's a very kind of well, like you said, there's a lot of twists and turns. Everything links together in unexpected ways, and it's all eventually unraveled in the end by the detective character Joseph Spector, who's the conjurer of the title. He's a retired music hall magician who has a knack for sort of unraveling these tangled and seemingly impossible scenarios and providing a logical explanation at the end.
Well, as I noted, this is your debut novel, and which is always fascinating to me because, um, Dave, that first novel, the first book you ever get into print is such a big deal. And I've talked with a lot of writers about their first book, and I'm always fascinated by how long it takes them to go from concept to reality. What was that journey like for you? Is this something that you've been working on for years, or is it something, that maybe didn't take you all that long? What was the process like for you in this, for getting this first book out there?
Well, it's an interesting one because it took me a very long time to get it written. It took a number of years because I was working full time to begin with, and then gradually kind of phased that out with part-time work, and now I'm lucky enough that I'm writing full time. So the actual writing did take a number of years because it was something that I was doing in my spare time. It was, as I said, really, it was about paying tribute to the writers that I like and admire. So obviously, I read a lot of locked room mysteries, golden age mysteries. Carr and Queen are favorites of mine, and they very much kind of seeped into my imagination. And I was keen to channel that influence into a sort of something new and hopefully an original contribution to the genre. But then once I got it written, things actually came together very quickly. It's all serendipity really, because as you mentioned, Lee Child selected the short story Heatwave for his Best Mysteries anthology, published by Mysterious Press, which opened an avenue of communication with Otto Penzler, who runs the Mysterious Bookshop, and he's the head of Mysterious Press and Penzler Publishers, etc. And he's such a big name in the genre. I've got a number of his American mystery classics. He's republished certain Ellery Queen titles, Carr titles. And he's also a big fan of locked room mysteries. I knew that because I've read interviews with him, etc. And I've got several anthologies that he's edited of locked room mystery short stories. So he's very much a kind of key figure in my particular subgenre of crime fiction. So he contacted me in the first instance about this short story, which is not a locked room mystery. It's more of a noir pastiche.
Which is, and it's
But
really, really good, by the way. If anyone sees that particular anthology, I mean, there's a lot of great authors, a lot of great stuff. That's a really good one. I can see why you wanted it. I enjoyed it quite.
That's very kind of you. Thank you for saying that. It's strangely, it's quite atypical from the kind of work that I usually do. But it was more of a fun experiment at the time. But I was pleased that people seem to have enjoyed it. But then obviously Otto got in touch with me, and so I just thought that I would chance my arm because I had the manuscript at that point, which was in need of editing. And it was sort of it wasn't it was getting there. It wasn't polished by any means, but it was a locked room mystery, and it was it was all about it was a pastiche of all these great authors that I love. So I emailed him and I said, would you be interested in reading this manuscript? Which is not the sort of thing that I would normally do, but I thought I'm not going to get this sort of opportunity every day, so I might as well go for it. And he sent me a very polite email saying, yes, feel free to send it. No guarantees, obviously. And really, all I was expecting was some sort of feedback about how to turn it into a proper novel, or maybe some suggestions about who else might like to read it. But to my surprise, he got back to me within the week. And was he had a ton of suggestions, a ton of ideas, and things that would help to really hone it and make it as strong as possible. But then he ended by saying that he would be very happy to publish it with Mysterious Press. So that was a dream come true, really, because it was sort of, because Otto is such an important part of the genre tradition that I love. So to get that kind of enthusiastic response was just amazing. So it took a long time to write, as I say, but the journey to publication was it was running away from me almost, how quickly it all happened.
Well, yeah, that's a fabulous bit of serendipity, I suppose, but clearly too, uh, that doesn't happen if the writing wasn't good and the story wasn't good. So clearly you had put in a lot of everything that needed to happen, the time and the work, and so kudos. And again, I can see why it really is a fabulous read. And now I want to make sure I understand. Is this intended to be the first in a series?
Yes, very much so. The detective character Joseph Spector has already appeared in some of the short stories that I've written, which are all impossible crimes with kind of an eerie magic themed element, but a logical, rational explanation at the end. So very much in the vein of Death and the Conjurer. But I like writing about that character and that era because because that era produced some of my favorite books. I don't know if you've read John Dickson Carr's The Hollow Man or The Three Coffins, as it was published under that name in the US. But that's just one of my favorite crime novels of them all. And the setup is not dissimilar to Death and the Conjurer. That's a conscious thing. When I was writing it, I was thinking, this is such fertile ground. There are so many things that you could do with this setup. So I couldn't resist trying to tackle it for myself. So it was always my plan to write more longer works with Spector and with the magic and the mystery and the stage illusions and all the kind of trickery and gimmicks that I love. He's
a really interesting character. I'm sorry to interrupt, but he's a really interesting character. If you would,
no problem.
Tell me a little bit more about him, because there's like a draw when you read that kind of a character. He's a fascinating character to read about. Is he based in any way on anybody that you knew, or how did tell the audience a little bit more about him?
Nobody that I knew. Yes, of course. Nobody that I know in real life, but I do have a real fascination with the history of stage magic and the great figures like Harry Houdini and David Devant and those kinds of real life historical figures. And I read a lot about stage magic and the kind of the sort of psychology of illusion and how these performers created these personas for the audience. And so it just seemed natural to me to have that kind of character as a detective, because it's somebody who kind of I always think that there's a real correlation between murder mysteries and stage illusions, because I think in both cases you've got the audience in front of you as the mystery writer, but also as the magician. You've got to deceive that audience. You've got to send them in the wrong direction. You've got to make sure that they're looking elsewhere while the real trick is being worked. So it seemed natural to have a character that kind of straddles those two worlds, the murder mystery and the and also the gimmickry and the clever tricks, illusions, crucial misinterpretations and things that fuel the world of magic.
What is so appealing about that? That we've noted the impossible crime. That's a very appealing thing for readers for a very long time. What's the appeal for you?
I think there are two particular aspects that really appeal to me. First would be the atmosphere that is created in an impossible crime story, because locked room mystery and impossible crime are, to my mind, fairly synonymous. It's usually a murder, but in Death and the Conjuror, there's also the impossible theft. But it's a crime that is committed under circumstances where it seems that no criminal could physically have managed to pull off the crime. So there's usually a really kind of eerie, almost surreal atmosphere to these stories when they're at their very best. As with John Dickson Carr, he was a real master of atmosphere. And there's a sort of a kind of an uncanny feel to them that just really resonates with me. I'm also a fan of classic ghost stories and horror fiction, but and I think impossible crime stories, they tap into a similar sort of vein. For instance, I think of short stories of John Dickson Carr's, like, for example, there's a great one that he wrote called Blind Man's Hood, which is a fantastic short story with an impossible crime that is legitimately explained in a very logical, rational way. But there is also an eerie supernatural element. There's a haunted house and a very sinister atmosphere to it. And I think that kind of the locked room mystery sits somewhere neatly between the horror and the crime fiction. The Burning Court is another great Carr novel which deals with witchcraft. And it's the whole question of is it real or is it all part of the illusion? And I really love that. But also I would say it's the puzzle element. It's the challenge as a reader. I think it's fun to kind of get into that battle of wits between the writer and the reader. It is sort of you lay down the challenge as the writer, that the reader that all the clues are there for the reader to solve the crime for themselves, but you're defying them not to. And I think that's a lot of fun as well.
Well, along those lines, so by their very nature, these kinds of stories have a lot of twists and turns. We've talked about that. When you sit down to write something like this, do you generally have a plot already worked out and then you populate it with your characters? Or you've mentioned, really liking Joseph Spector and having him appear in other stories. Is there a character that you prefer to build plots around? Is there an order to that, or really does it just change, with effort to effort?
Yeah, it's very flexible, to be honest with you. In some cases I'll come up with an impossible scenario, and I'll try to think of ways that it could be achieved in mystery fiction. So in some cases there'll be real life impossibilities, which are a fertile ground for fiction. Like, for instance, there's a famous sort of ghost story from the south coast of England about the so-called devil's footprints that appeared in the snow back in the 1800s, that were never rationally explained. These kind of eerie, animal-like black footprints that traversed sections of the countryside and villages. And a writer called Norman Barrow wrote a really great book where he took that unexplained phenomenon and he gave it a rational explanation. So I've tried my hand at that with certain short stories, in that I've taken a real life unexplained phenomenon and tried to give it a rational explanation. But then at the other end of the scale, what will happen is I will come up with a gimmick or an effect that I want to use. So I'll devise a scenario around that. Sometimes it's a case of visiting a place and coming up with ways that it could feature in a mystery. And also, obviously, as you mentioned, the characters, coming up with a character that I like and thinking what else could I do with them. So it really does depend. With Death and the Conjuror, it was I would say it was a mixture, in that I came up with this sort of overarching plot and I knew how I wanted it to end, but the various twists and kind of subplots and additional characters that appear on the way, they were the product of a lot of editing and rewriting, etc.
Yeah, I have found in the process of editing, new characters or drastically altered characters become the norm, because it ends up just being part of the process. You realize the story would be better if we did it this way, right? But along those lines, so as I noted, you're a pretty solid short story writer, and I've had some really good success with that. And I've had writers tell me, oh, nobody should ever make their very first writing project a novel. It's too hard. There's too much stuff going on there. You really should start with short stories, because that's how you really learn your craft. And of course, I've talked to other writers who said they've never written a short story in their life after grade school, right? So they've done quite well. What's your thought on that? If you had it to do over again, would you do it the same way, I suppose, with starting with short stories and then building up to the novel, or is that really going to be an individual thing, you think?
I do think it's a very individual, personal development issue. It's I know that I couldn't have written Death and the Conjurer, which is my first book. I couldn't have written it if I hadn't developed my ideas and my style through the short stories that I've been writing. So from my perspective, the short stories were certainly a vital component in the development of what would eventually become a full-length novel. But it is a unique personal experience, really. I mean, I've studied creative writing, and I've delivered some creative writing workshops and things like that. And really, at the end of the day, it's about learning how to do things, learning what's going to work. I don't think there is a set way of doing these things.
What draws you to short stories? They have the same thing: beginning, middle, end, arc, all the things that are in a novel, and of course, much shorter format. But what is it that draws you to writing in that format?
Well, I tend to, again, likening it to stage magic, I tend to think of a full-length mystery novel as being like a full spectacular David Copperfield style stage performance where all the illusions are neatly threaded together and there's a narrative structure that unfolds. Whereas with a short story, I think of it more like a kind of street magic, kind of a three-card Monty style, where the skill is still there. It still requires a really high level of skill to pull it off, but it lacks the bells and whistles of the full length show. So it's the same kind of effect that you can achieve with a really good short story that you can with a novel, in my opinion. Just minus the bells and whistles. It's the same kind of discipline.
Do you ever find yourself suffering from writer's block? And I ask a lot of writers this because I think everyone who's ever sat in front of a blank screen or a blank page has sat there and stared at it for a long time, wondering now what. You know, what do you ever suffer writer's block? And if you do, how do you get out of it?
Yes, it's certainly something that I've had to work on now that I'm writing full time. Because when I was working in other jobs, obviously I could just write when I felt like it. But now there's a real added incentive. I've got to get the words on the page. So what I do is I keep a Word document full of ideas, maybe a little line of dialogue or an image or a name or something that struck me. I keep a kind of running list of these ideas so that if ever I find myself in a position where I'm struggling to get to the end of a sentence, I can always just flick through that and just get the ideas circulating again. That seems to work for me. It's helped me in the past, and maybe I'll come up with a title, for instance, and I'll think I could build a short story around that. But I just keep this kind of running list of these ideas so that if ever I am struggling, there's always something that I can go back to and latch onto again and try and kind of recapture that enthusiasm I had for it in the first place.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because I was going to ask you about that. I know writers often hate being asked where they come up with their ideas. And, you know, and I was going to ask if you had a file full of random ideas and thoughts, and it sounds like you do. So,
I do, yes, yeah. As I said, I read a lot about stage magic and the history of magic, which with these Joseph Spector stories is really is hugely important to the writing of those stories. If it's an idea for an illusion, for example, or a kind of a means of misdirecting an audience, something like that. I come across all kinds of things that can be extrapolated to the world of murder mysteries.
Short, i.e., short version is you do the work and never turn off your creativity. I think it's one of the reasons a lot of writers don't like being asked that question. They're like, well, look, if you're a writer, everything's an idea, right? Everything's a possibility. You just have to be willing to, you know, to keep your mind in that space. And so if you're asking me where I come up with my ideas, how about you not be lazy and go work on how to, you know, put your own lists together. That's how these things work, right? I mean, so kudos.
Well, yeah, I mean the ideas do come up in unlikely scenarios. You know, it just kind of everyday things. You'll think, huh, that could be a useful little feature. I mean, I think of Stephen King, who so many of his early stories revolve around ordinary domestic settings where something is slightly off or wrong. I mean, think of a story like The Mangler, which is, I don't know if you know that story, but it's about the cursed uh, laundry machine.
Hmm.
And it's so obviously a product of real life. You can just picture a young Stephen King seeing that and thinking, huh, I could, I could turn that into a hideous monster. And really, it's the same for murder mysteries and crime fiction. From my experience, you see a real life place, or you meet a person, and you think you would be a great character. And that's just the way it works for me.
Authors have to have a really finely tuned antenna for the world, I think. And that's really what you're describing, just being really open to the world around you and seeing the possibilities for telling stories. And I admire that trait. It's you know, I don't know if you have to be born with it, but you certainly have to be able to develop it if you weren't. Because
Absolutely.
I mean, that's how you
Yeah. I
keep
mean, this
doing
is
stuff.
yeah, and as I said, with having delivered creative writing workshops and having studied creative writing myself in the past, the most important takeaway from those kinds of courses is always, at the end of the day, you have to find your own way into it. You have to find your own approach that works for you.
Well, I always like to end on something, a question that I mean to be fun. I hope it's fun, a little challenging as well. This is why I don't share it with anybody until the end. So let us say I had the magical power to put you together for a conversation, dinner, drinks, whatever you want, with any one of the following three people. Who would you choose and why? And the options I'm going to give you are the great Dashiell Hammett, great author Dashiell Hammett, Sherlock Holmes, the legendary Harry Houdini, or the not quite as legendary, but a woman referred to as Lady Houdini, Kristen Johnson. One of those three people I could put you together with for a conversation of some sort. Who would you choose and why?
Question, because they're people. Kristen Johnson, I'm glad you mentioned her. She's fascinating figure in the world of magic and eschatology. It would have to be Harry Houdini, just because I've read so much about him. I love Daniel Sashauer's mystery novels, where he reimagines Houdini as an amateur detective. I love those books because they're also impossible crimes. But yeah, Houdini, there's just such a mystique around the around him that is really still fascinating to me. And he, at the same time, is somebody who had a keen sense of logic. Because I know that he was very keen on debunking fraudulent psychic mediums and all the kind of supernatural humbug around those things. So yeah, he'd just be such a fascinating person, I think.
Well, I highly I think I agree with that. If I had to choose one of those, he'd probably been mine too. Well, that's all we have time for today. I want to give a big thank you to the very talented Tom Mead for joining me today, as we've been talking about his debut novel, Death and the Conjuror. Will be released everywhere on July 12th. I highly recommend it. It's a fabulous read. It's a fascinating read. I'm sure, Tom, we're going to be hearing a lot more from you for years to come. Big congratulations. I didn't really note it, but you've been getting really great reviews, a lot of comparisons to Carr, comparisons to Agatha Christie. A lot of really successful folks have weighed in on your work, and I really think you're at the start a brilliant career here. So I really appreciate you making some time to come talk a little
Thank
of
you
me
so
today.
much. Thank you so much. That's really flattering, and I'm just delighted to hear from readers and people who are telling me that they're enjoying the book. It's so great, especially because it was a labor of love. It was something that I was writing with no real intention of it ever seeing the light of day. I was writing it just for myself, just because it kept me entertained. So it's such a thrill to hear from people like yourself who are enjoying it.
Well, absolutely. Well, a last reminder for everybody today. If you enjoyed today's show, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss a new author interview. I mean, you can go spend a lot of money on craft books, or you can just come watch my show and hear from really intelligent, successful people like Tom Mead here, who should just shared a whole wealth of information about writing and crime fiction and mysteries and locked room mysteries. So, hey, you can get this every week by just signing up. And if you do, like say, if you got something out of it, please leave me a review, help other people find it, help people like Tom reach more of an audience. I think everybody wins that way. Really appreciate that. I'm going to sign us off now, but until next time, I'll leave you with one final thought, which is tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please make today count. I'm Rich Eisen. This has been the open mic for myself and Tom Mead. We'll see you next time.